The backyard was thick with July heat and the smell of charcoal smoke when he said it. 23 people around him, cousins and neighbors, and his mother in the lawn chair with her sweet tea sweating rings onto the picnic table. He had raised his 6th beer. I know because I had been counting, not because I was worried about how much he was drinking, but because I had developed, over the years, the habit of cataloging the small things, the 6th beer, the texts he deleted before dinner, the way his eyes kept going to his phone even when the grill needed tending. He raised that bottle the way a man raises something when he has had enough to stop measuring himself. He was talking to his cousin Marcus about regret, about the things a man carries, about the decisions that define you. And then, with a small laugh, the kind that follows a thing that was supposed to stay inside, he set it down in the air between all 23 of us and left it there. I never wanted our daughter. A few people looked at their plates. His mother's eyes cut to mine for exactly 1 second before they moved away. And 30 feet from where I was standing, by the cooler, my daughter Kezia was 28 years old, and I watched the back of her neck go completely still. The way a person goes still when they have spent their whole life trying not to know something, and it finally arrives anyway, fully confirmed, in their father's voice. The barbecue did not stop. That is the thing about moments like that. The world does not honor them with a pause. Someone turned the music up. Gerald's Uncle Joe started laughing at something Marcus said on the other end of the yard, and the laughter traveled across the grass like nothing had landed in the air between all 23 of us. Someone else went for a second plate. His mother set her sweet tea down and picked it back up again and smoothed something on her house dress that wasn't there. And I stood 30 feet from my daughter and watched her pick up a plastic cup and take a drink and set it back down with the precise, careful movements of a woman learning in real time how to hold herself together in public. She did not look at me. I did not go to her. We had spent 28 years learning to carry the same things without naming them to each other. That afternoon, standing on opposite ends of a backyard that smelled of charcoal and something finally burning off, we were doing it for the last time. I did not say a word. I was wearing my bright coral house dress with big pockets, and I pressed both hands into those pockets, and I made my face go flat and still, and I said nothing. I had been practicing that particular silence for a long time. I was very, very good at it. That was July. Now let me take you back to the winter before all of it, and then I'll tell you exactly what I did about it. If someone in your life has ever made you question your own mind, share this story with someone who needs it, because what I'm about to tell you shows exactly how that trick is done. I am sitting by the phone that never rings anymore. This is winter in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the cold has settled in the way it does here, quietly and with full intention, pressing its face against the glass, fogging up my windows with the warmth of the pot roast I started before sunrise. The phone is the old landline on the windowsill of my shotgun house, rooms lined up in a row like train cars, each one leading straight into the next, all the way back to the porch that looks out over the waterfront neighborhood. From here, I can see the fishing boats knocked against their docks and the seagulls making their morning case above the water. I am 56 years old. I am wearing my bright coral house dress with big pockets because in winter, when you live alone, you wear the thing that doesn't ask anything of you. The gospel music is playing low from the radio in the living room. Mahalia this morning. And this morning calls for Mahalia. My worn leather Bible with handwritten notes in the margins is open on the chair beside me, the same page since August. A verse my grandmother underlined in pencil before she pressed the Bible into my hands when I was 12 years old and told me, "This will be useful someday." The Bible is a little rough along the spine now, rougher than it used to be, and there is a reason for that I will get to. But it is still here, still open, still the most honest thing in the room. The phone does not ring. Before July, It rang on Sunday mornings. My sister Cora, the women from church checking on domino times after the second service, his mother doing her careful performance of warmth. But that was before July. That was before I understood the shape of what I had been living inside for 3 decades. Let me tell you about Gerald, and about what 31 years of silence and Sunday pot roast can cost a woman who was told to be grateful for the life she had, instead of the life she had been heading toward. His name was Gerald Allen Simmons. The only time I will say all 3 names, because I want them to land, and then I want to leave them on the floor where they belong. We married in 1994 when I was 24 and he was 31. He had a job at the Port Authority, steady income, a pressed shirt for Sunday mornings. He had a way of making you feel when his full attention was on you, like the most perceptive person in the room. I understand now what that attention was for. At the time, I thought it was love. What it was a preview of the control that would follow. The first cracks were so small, I blamed the light. Something not quite right about the way he answered questions. Something not quite right about the evenings when his phone rang and he stepped outside to take it. I noticed. I filed it away in the drawer where I had been trained to put the things I wasn't sure I was allowed to notice. And then I went back to the kitchen and turned the pot roast down and let the gospel music fill up the room, and I told myself, this is a good life. This is enough. There had been a Saturday in 1997. Kezia was 3 years old, and I had been offered a weekend shift coordinating intake at a community health fair, the same health center I had been volunteering at for 2 years. The one run by a woman named Dr. Adisa, who had looked at my work and said directly, "You belong in healthcare." I had been careful about asking. I had told Gerald a week in advance. I had arranged for his mother to watch Kezia. And that Saturday morning he said he had a headache and his mother couldn't make it, and he had not agreed to any of this. I missed the shift. Dr. Adisa was gracious. But when I returned the following month, something had shifted in how she looked at me. Not unkindly, but with the careful recalibration of a woman who had learned to plan around someone else's unreliability. That look cost me more than the missed Saturday. It cost me the version of myself that Dr. Adisa had been beginning to see. I filed that away in the drawer, too. Something was wrong. It had been wrong for longer than I knew, and it was going to find its way to the surface whether I was ready or not. His mother called him a good provider. The men at the Port Authority called him dependable. And at church, the same church where I played dominoes after second service every Sunday, with Miss Patricia and Lorraine, and a woman everyone called Ducky who had been widowed twice and laughed like she'd reached some final agreement with loss. The congregation greeted him with the nods reserved for men who present well. He performed excellently. You need to understand the mechanism before you can understand why I stayed inside it for so long. It was not dramatic. It was surgical. Each year, a small adjustment was made to the way I saw myself. A correction here. You always blow things out of proportion. A dismissal there. I don't know why you can't just let things go. Over time, these corrections became my internal weather. Before I could form a response to anything, I heard his voice inside my own thoughts, pre-correcting me, telling me I was about to get it wrong again. Self-doubt was not a flaw I had been born with. It had been installed, gradually, deliberately, by a man who needed my confusion to maintain his freedom. I know someone listening right now knows exactly what I mean. You know what it is to be inside a house where the truth is whatever he decides it is that morning, where your memory keeps being wrong and his keeps being right, and somewhere in the gap between them, you lost the thread back to yourself. That is not weakness. That is what happens when a specific strategy is applied consistently over years by someone who knows exactly which lever to pull. The betrayal arrived in small measures. 3 years ago, the weekends started to add up differently. He went to the dock on Saturdays. He came home on a Tuesday in October, smelling of a heavy floral perfume I did not own. I noticed the first time. By the 5th time, I said something. He gave me the look he had spent decades refining, the one that said you are making something out of nothing, and we both know it. He said it was the soap they used at the facility. He said, "You always make everything about you." And I was standing in the kitchen of my shotgun house, holding a dish towel, and I said, "You're right. I'm sorry." I thanked him for correcting me. I want you to sit with that. I thanked him. Here is what I sacrificed for this man. In 1990, I was 20 years old with a full scholarship to nursing school. I had already bought the scrubs. I had told everyone at church. My grandmother pressed my worn leather Bible into my hands and said she was proud. Gerald cried at my mother's kitchen table. He said he wasn't ready, that he needed me home, that he couldn't do it alone. I deferred one semester, then another. Then the scholarship went to someone else, and I stood in my mother's kitchen and felt something close shut inside me so quietly I almost didn't hear the click. That door cost me $34,000 a year in potential income at the height of my working years. It cost me a profession. It cost me the version of me I was in the process of becoming when he cried. But you don't get to grieve that in peace, not inside that kind of marriage. Every time I came close to the shape of the loss, he had a way of turning it into evidence of my selfishness. And back into the drawer it went. Sundays were my exhale. The pot roast going all morning, garlic, bay leaf, the slow cooking patience of a woman with nowhere else to put her care. And then service, and then the domino table with Miss Patricia and Lorraine and Ducky. When I sat down with those women with my leather Bible in my bag, and the gospel music coming from the little speaker in the corner of the fellowship hall, I was, for about 2 hours, entirely real, entirely myself. The woman with the nursing school scholarship, not the woman who had set it aside. And then I went home. The seeds were everywhere once I learned how to look. But I did not yet know how to look. What I had, sitting by that foggy window in winter, was the certainty that something was wrong, and a drawer full of things I had been trained not to trust. That drawer was about to be emptied. The discovery did not come the way I had imagined it would. August 9th, 2023, a Thursday, 11:32 at night. He was in the shower. His phone was on the kitchen counter. I was rinsing the last of the dinner dishes. Sunday pot roast reheated, the same recipe I had made without variation for 3 decades, when his phone lit up. A text notification from a contact saved as just a single letter, D. The message read, "She figured it out yet? You always said she was too slow to notice anything." I set the dish down carefully, the way you set something down when you are not certain your hands are going to cooperate. And then I picked up the phone. 46 messages in that thread. I read every one. I stood in my kitchen in my coral house dress, and I read all 46. And the world did not get louder. It got quieter. That specific, absolute quiet that lands when everything you have been half-knowing for years is finally confirmed in someone else's handwriting. He had called me dead weight. He had told this woman, whoever she was, whatever she was to him, that our daughter Kezia was a mistake he never asked for. He had written with his own thumbs on the phone he deleted from every night, "I'm only here for the house." I kept reading. There were messages where he described Kezia, our daughter, the child I had carried and raised and prayed over for 28 years, not with the grief of a man who had loved and failed, but in a flat, transactional way, the way you talk about a bad investment that didn't perform. There was a message from 2022 where he had written that if he had known how she would turn out, strong-willed and like me, those were his exact words, he would have made a different decision entirely before she was born. I had not known, until I read that such a conversation had ever existed between them. I did not remember any hint. I set the phone down on the counter and picked it up again and read the message one more time to make certain I had read it correctly. I had. I put the phone back down exactly where I found it. My hands were steadier than I would have expected. The stillness in me was not peace. It was the particular stillness that arrives when the worst possible thing has finally happened, and your body understands that surviving it is now the only item on the agenda. 46 messages, 31 years of marriage. And somewhere in this business he had been conducting on the side, he had built an entire second version of our life. One in which I was the obstacle, the joke, the woman too slow to notice anything. I put the phone back down exactly where I found it. Gerald came out of the bathroom in his t-shirt. He said goodnight without looking at me. I heard him settle into sleep. At 11:47, 15 minutes later, I walked into the living room. My worn leather Bible with handwritten notes in the margins was on the chair. The one my grandmother had given me when I was 12. The one I had carried to every hard moment of my adult life, as if proximity to it was a form of armor. I picked it up, and I threw it against the wall. The sound it made was softer than I expected. Not a crash, more like a wing folding wrong. It split along the spine. The pages fanned across the floor of the shotgun house, and I sat down in the middle of them on the cold floor in my coral house dress, and I could not stand up again for 2 hours. The gospel music was still playing low from the radio in the next room. I let it play. I did not turn it off. Because if I turned it off, the silence would have become something I had to be inside of entirely alone, and I was not ready for that yet. I want to say something to anyone who has ever sat on a floor in the dark with the worst thing they have ever learned still hot in their hands. You are not falling apart. You are breaking down correctly. The floor is not the bottom. Sometimes the floor is where the truth finally gets loud enough to hear clearly, and where the part of you that has been waiting quietly all along finally gets permission to stand up. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the water moving under the docks and the seagulls beginning to settle, and I made a list in my head of every single thing I had noticed over 31 years and chosen not to trust. The list was long, and by the time the sky started to change, I had stopped crying. I had started planning. The following Sunday I went to church. I sat in my usual pew, third from the back on the left side, and I sang the hymns and bowed my head and held the shell of myself together through the entire service. After dismissal, while the women were setting up for dominoes and the coffee had reached the back of the sanctuary, I walked to Reverend May Holloway's office and knocked on the door. She had known me for 19 years. She had presided over my mother's homegoing service. She had sat with me through 3 miscarriages before Kezia arrived. She had the kind of eyes that do not look away from hard things. And believe me, over the years I had tested that in her. When I opened the door and she saw my face, she said nothing except, "Sit down." I had printed the screenshots at the library on Friday morning, 6 pages. Everything laid out in timestamp order, folded in my pocket. I put them on her desk. She read every word. She did not flinch. She read them the way a woman reads something she has been dreading but not entirely surprised by. When she finished, she set the pages down, folded her hands, and looked at me. She said, "The voice that told you that you were too slow to notice. Whose voice was that? Really?" I didn't answer because I already knew. She said, 31 years of Sunday dinners and set-aside dreams and raised children don't belong to a woman who is not worth wanting. You hear me? The lie was planted deliberately by someone who needed you confused. A confused woman doesn't ask questions. A confused woman stays. I cried, not the hollow crying of the floor. This was different. Something underneath the grief that felt closer to release, like a window cracked in a room that had been sealed for too long. Reverend May Holloway gave me back the one word I had not realized until that moment that I had lost. The word was enough. I had been enough. I had always been enough. The measurement had been rigged by someone with a very strong personal interest in keeping me exactly where I was. She named the tactics. That is the thing I need you to understand about what she did for me. It was not only comfort, it was clarity. She had seen this shape before, the strategic erosion of a woman's self-trust by someone who needed her uncertain. When she named it plainly, sitting in her office with the sound of dominoes starting in the fellowship hall down the corridor, it lost a significant portion of its power. You cannot be confused by what you can now name. I went home that Sunday And Gerald was on the couch watching football and eating from a bag of chips, and I said hey, and he said hey, and nothing in the room revealed that everything had already changed. He did not know his leverage had expired. He did not know that the confusion he had been carefully tending for 30 years had just been swept out of me by a 19-year friendship and 6 printed pages. But I knew something else now. Emotion was not going to be enough. Knowing the truth was not enough. I was going to need allies. And I was thinking about 2 women who had already been watching for longer than I had. His sister Darlene and Kezia. The shift inside me was quiet, but total. The weight of grief had done its work. Cold, focused clarity had moved in to take its place. I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I understood. Now the question was how and when and how completely I was going to act. The answer was coming together faster than he could have imagined. Here is what it looks like, from the inside, to mask your intentions while preparing for what comes next. It looks like Sunday pot roast. It looks like saying good morning in the same voice you have used for 30 years. It looks like sitting on your side of the couch and watching the same programs and handing a man his coffee with the same hands that have been quietly building his reckoning for 3 weeks. It looks like performing a role in a play that has already closed. I had done harder things. I had been doing this kind of performance, in one form or another, for decades. The first concrete act of my liberation was small enough to be invisible. It was a Wednesday, the 3rd week of September. I drove to the grocery store on the main road by the waterfront, the one where the windows steam up in the mornings and you can smell the bread they bake in the back. And I walked through the flower section at the entrance, the buckets of grocery store flowers in their plastic sleeves, and I stopped in front of the yellow ones. Sunflowers. A full bright bunch. I had never once in 31 years of marriage bought myself flowers. Flowers in our house had always been what Gerald brought home when something needed softening, which told you everything about the flowers and everything about the marriage. I picked up the yellow bunch. I carried it to the register. I paid for it with my own money, my own dollars, earned, not negotiated for, not asked permission for. I drove home and put them in the mason jar on the back porch, and I sat for a long moment looking at them, and I said out loud to no one, "This is mine." That was when I knew I was going to make it through. I know some of you are thinking, flowers? That is the liberation? And I want to say exactly that. Yes. When you have spent 31 years in a life whose terms were set entirely by someone else, buying something beautiful simply because it pleases you, with money you earned, without accounting for the cost or asking whether it was okay, that is an act of genuine defiance. Every yellow sunflower I put in that mason jar was a small declaration of sovereignty. Mine. Not a gift, not an apology. Mine. Reverend May Holloway and I had begun meeting on Tuesday mornings over coffee at her kitchen table. She had a way of being available without making it into something formal, which I appreciated. She asked about Darlene one afternoon. I told her I was thinking about calling. She said, "What's stopping you?" I said I wasn't sure Darlene would say what she knew. Reverend Holloway poured more coffee and said, "Women who have been watching in silence usually just need someone to go first." So I went first. I called Darlene on a Friday afternoon in early October, while Gerald was at the Port Authority accumulating his separate fortune of carefully managed lies. I said, "Darlene, I know you've been watching. I know you've been waiting. So have I. And I think it's time we compared notes." A long pause followed. Long enough that I thought she was going to deflect, and then she said, "I've had voicemails saved since 2021. My whole chest opened, like a sealed room remembering it has windows. We talked for 2 hours. The close call came in late October. I had been printing additional records at the library and brought the envelope home, tucked behind the winter coats in the back of my closet. The following Saturday, Gerald was looking for something in that closet, and I watched from the hallway as his hand moved toward the envelope. My heart went completely silent, 1 full second, no sound at all. And then his hand closed around a coat instead. He walked back to the living room. I stood in the hallway for 30 seconds before my lungs remembered their work. Then I drove that envelope straight to Reverend Holloway's house and asked her to hold it. Kezia called that same week. She said, "Mama, what are you doing?" I said, "Something that should have been done a long time ago." She said, in the steady voice she has had since she was 6 years old, "Tell me how I can help." And we were 3. The email was not written in anger. I want you to understand that specifically, because I think people expect the final act of a story like this to be fueled by white-hot rage, the shaking hands kind that produces mistakes and regret. By the time I sat down to write that email, I was past rage. I had been through the floor. I had been through the cold, hollow weeks that followed. What I wrote with was something colder and more precise than anger. Something that felt, from the inside, like clarity that had finally gotten organized. But first, there was the back porch meeting. A cold Thursday evening in late November. The sky had gone dark early the way it does in winter in Charlotte, and the fishing boats on the waterfront were lit at their bows with small points of light reflecting in the dark water. Darlene arrived first, canvas bag in hand, coat still buttoned. Kezia arrived 15 minutes later. She sat down, looked at me, looked at Darlene, looked at the table between us, and said, "All right, let's put it all down." We did. We were at it for 4 hours. The chill came off the waterfront as the night deepened, and I brought out the quilt from the back of the linen closet, and Darlene wrapped it around her shoulders without being asked, and we kept going. There is something clarifying about laying evidence out on a physical surface, not reading it on a screen, not holding it in memory, but setting it down where 3 women can look at it together and say out loud, "This is real, this happened, this is documented. The weight of it is real when it is real." When we moved from one piece to the next, something shifted in that back porch, the way temperature shifts when a window is cracked after a long sealed season. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet exit of doubt that has been living in a room long past its welcome. Darlene had been collecting for 2 years. Voicemails from 2021 where he referenced the other woman by her full name, not just Dee, a full name, and voicemails where he spoke about the house in terms that made clear he had been planning for a long time. She had photographs of bank statements taken during Thanksgiving dinners when no one was paying attention to her, and she had a text he had sent her by mistake in 2022, clearly meant for Dee. "She's not going to know what hit her." He had sent that to his own sister. He was right about one thing. She was not going to know what hit her, but he had the wrong woman in mind. Kezia had the video from the July BBQ, 11 seconds, uncut, shot from where she was standing by the cooler, his face clearly visible. 3 family members in the frame. She had backed it up in 3 places, which told me she had been prepared for longer than she had let on. I had the 46 messages printed and time-stamped. The text from Dee that had lit everything up. The records from the library envelope. And, in the voice note application on my phone, a recording from the 2nd week of October. A kitchen conversation I had steered carefully until he said 2 things out loud that confirmed what we already knew. He had no idea. He thought he was just correcting me again, the way he always had. Reverend Holloway sat with us for part of that evening, in the corner chair, holding the space the way she always did. When we had laid everything out on the table and the weight of it had finally found its proper shape, she said, "Now, what do you want the outcome to be?" I had thought about this carefully. I knew he was not going to surrender money or property. I knew there would be no dramatic institutional reckoning, no judge handing down a verdict. What I wanted was not destruction. I want you to know that. What I wanted was for the 23 people who had been standing in that July backyard, who had laughed and looked at their plates and performed comfortable ignorance, to know the truth. And I wanted Kezia to have it documented in his own words that what she had sensed her entire life was real. We drafted the email together. The email was to go to Gerald, to his mother, to his supervisor at the Port Authority, to each of the 23 family members who had been at the BBQ that July. Every piece of evidence attached. The video clip, the messages, the voicemails, 41 pages total. On the morning we finished drafting, I drove past the Port Authority on the way to the store. The silver BMW 7 Series was in the lot, sleek, expensive, paid for with income built, while he told me I was too slow to notice anything. I looked at it, and I thought, the house, the car, the wealth he has been accumulating while I apologized. He can keep every bit of it. What I am taking is the only thing that was ever mine. I wrote 2 closing lines for Gerald specifically. I spent 3 days on those 2 lines. The email was scheduled. December 4th, 7 in the morning, a Tuesday, December 4th, 2023. I was up at 5. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the winter dark over the waterfront, the fishing boats still on the black water, the seagulls not yet moving. The gospel music was playing low. The house was warm, in the way a house is warm, just before something that cannot be undone. Gerald came downstairs at 6:15. He poured coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his phone and scrolled with the particular ease of a man who has never had reason to be careful. I had scheduled the email 45 minutes earlier. 41 pages, every attachment, titled, What I Noticed. At 7 o'clock, his phone made a sound I had never heard it make before. He looked down at it. He frowned. He opened it. He read the subject line, and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do in 31 years. I watched it empty, all at once, the way a cup empties when you turn it over. Everything in it, just gone. He looked up at me. I was already looking at him. I said, "You called me too slow to notice. Here is what I noticed." He went through all the stages. I had expected this. I had read enough by then to know the order. Denial first. This is not what it looks like. Then minimization. It was nothing. It was a long time ago. Then the reversal, the version that always came last, the one he always believed would work. You drove me to this. You were never present. This is your fault. He got through all 3 in about 4 minutes. His voice climbed. He said I had violated his privacy. He said this was harassment. He said he would call a lawyer. I said, I've already spoken to one. Something in him broke then. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse you see in films. It broke quietly, like a foundation settling in the wrong direction, slow and permanent. He sat back in his chair. He set his phone down, and he looked at me with something that might, from the outside, have resembled respect. It was not respect. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that the woman he spent 30 years calling too slow to notice had been watching him from a very long distance, with great patience, for a very long time. The phone calls started within the hour. His mother first, his cousin Marcus. Then someone from the Port Authority. The fact of that call told me the email had found people he had not prepared for. He came back into the kitchen twice. Both times he started to say something. Both times I gave him nothing. Not anger, not tears. Not the confusion he had spent 30 years carefully tending in me. I gave him stillness. The deliberate, unhurried stillness of a woman who has already moved on and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. Before I left the kitchen for the last time that morning, I said the second line I had written over 3 days. I want you to hear it. You said you stayed for the house. Now you can have it, and everything that goes with it. I picked up my coffee. I walked to the back porch. I sat in my chair with the mason jar of yellow sunflowers on the table beside me, and I looked out at the waterfront where the fishing boats were beginning to move in the winter light, and I breathed. For the first time in a very long time, I breathed like the air actually belonged to me. I want to say something to every person who has ever been told they are too small to fight back, too confused to act, too far gone to reclaim what was theirs. That email was 41 pages. It was built by 3 women over 2 years. And at its core, it was written with the most valuable thing I owned, 31 years of patience that had finally found its purpose. He thought that taking everything from a woman meant he had won. He forgot that endurance over enough time becomes strategy. He kept the house. I want to say that plainly because I know how it sounds, and I know what people hope for when they have followed a story this far. Gerald Allen Simmons kept the house and the silver BMW 7 Series and the Port Authority job and the income. There was no courtroom, no judge, no institution that looked at 41 pages and handed down a formal verdict in my favor. Justice in my story was not the institutional kind. I spent several weeks in December sitting with the particular bitterness of knowing that a person can do what he did and still drive through Charlotte every morning without a single legal consequence. And then the other kind of justice arrived, slowly, from every direction at once. His mother called me on a Sunday evening in mid-December. She is 74 years old, and she is from a family that does not do public reckoning. She said, "I am sorry. I didn't know the half of it, and the half I knew I should have named." She did not beg. She asked carefully, the way a person asks when they understand they have earned the right to ask and no more. And I gave her what she asked for because she had told the truth, and the truth cost her something. Darlene stopped returning his calls. His cousin Marcus went quiet in the group chat. Something happened at the Port Authority after the email arrived. The details were never shared with me, and I did not ask for them. But the result was a reassignment. In Port Authority terms, that means something even when it means nothing officially. His net worth in social currency, which had always been his actual fortune, began to spend very differently. I heard about some of it secondhand. The way things travel in close communities, through Reverend Holloway, through Ducky, who heard things at the church social and passed them on with the knowing look of a woman widowed twice who had seen men crumble before. Gerald had expected the email to be embarrassing. What he had not fully calculated was that it would be believed. That was his final miscalculation, the assumption that the version of me he had spent 30 years presenting to the community was the version they had accepted wholesale. What he had not accounted for was that the community had its own drawer full of quiet observations. The women at the domino table had seen things. The women in the third pew had noticed things. Miss Patricia, who he had once called always stirring something, had been watching him at church socials for longer than he realized. The email did not create the doubt about Gerald. The email simply gave people permission to stop being polite about what they had already suspected. Kezia called me the week after the email. She said, "Mama, I've known my whole life that something was wrong with how he looked at me. I just didn't know it was permission I needed to trust it." I said, "You never needed his permission. You never needed mine either. The knowing was always yours." And I heard her breathe on the other end of the phone the way I had breathed on the back porch, like air that finally belonged to her. My worn leather Bible with handwritten notes in the margins had been taken to a bookbinder on Trade Street who worked with old Bibles. He restitched the spine with patience and care. The seam is still visible if you look for it. My grandmother's pencil marks are still there. My notes in blue ink are still there. The verse she marked when she handed it to me at 12 years old is still there, and it reads differently now than it did before the floor. Before the floor, it was comfort. After the floor, it is evidence. Evidence that I was always going to survive this. The breaking did not ruin it. The breaking became part of what it is. My rebirth looks nothing like what I expected. I thought it would look like getting things back, the career, the income, the self I had postponed in 1990. What it actually looks like is smaller and more solid than that. I started a Sunday group at the church. Women come in quietly, referred by Reverend May Holloway, some of them carrying the exact look I had the morning I walked into her office, with 6 pages folded in my pocket. We sit in a circle and we name the tactics. We talk about what it means to have your own perception used against you day after day by someone who knows exactly how to use it. And I watch, every Sunday, as something behind their eyes begins to shift from fog to something sharper. That is worth more to me than any dollar amount I could name. I have been saving money, my own, earned from a part-time position at the community health center. The closest I have come to the nursing work I walked away from in 1990. Every week I buy yellow flowers and put them in the mason jar. Every week I transfer a small amount into an account with no name attached to it but mine, building quietly toward a number that will let me do the thing I have been thinking about since December. There is a quiet town on the other side of the state where nobody knows my history. I found it driving back from a church conference in the spring. A small place, clean and still, the kind where the air smells different. I have found a rental there. I am close to the number I need. When I arrive, I will be driving a BMW 7 Series in sleek silver. Not because I need a car like that. Because I want to sit inside something beautiful that is entirely mine and has his name attached to nothing. Not his money, not his permission, not his idea of what I am worth. I will not be anyone's footnote. Spring came in quietly this year, not the way winter had. Winter had arrived with persistence and full intention, pressing its face against the glass. Spring arrived like something testing warmth against the memory of cold, careful, taking its time before committing. The seagulls over the waterfront neighborhood started their mornings earlier. The fishing boats moved with more energy in the light. And on a morning in March, I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee and looked out at clear water and thought, the view is different from here. Something has lifted that I did not know how to name before, and now I do. I am 56 years old, and I am living, for the first time in 31 years, in a direction I chose. The Sunday group has 7 women now, and is growing. Reverend May Holloway holds the space with us, which means there is never only grief in that circle. There is grief, and there is naming, and there is the particular energy that moves through a room when a woman hears the words that describe what she has been living inside and realizes she has not been imagining it. I have watched 4 women in that circle make the decision I made in December. I have watched 2 more, still in the middle of finding their footing. And I have watched all of them do the thing that seems the smallest and matters the most, begin to trust themselves again. What I want to tell you about now is the methods. What I wish someone had placed plainly in front of me 20 years ago, sitting at that domino table, not yet ready to name what I was living inside. Because what was done to me has a name, and the self-doubt it produced in me was not a byproduct. It was the goal. It is called manipulator tactics. And there are 3 that I lived inside for 31 years that I want you to be able to recognize. First, the correction of perception. He did not need to convince me I was wrong about facts. He only needed to correct my interpretations often enough that I stopped trusting my interpretations entirely. You always blow things out of proportion is not a statement about reality. It is a strategy, repeated until the target begins to apply it to herself before he even has to. Second, the shift of responsibility. Every time I noticed something and named it, the conversation moved immediately to my behavior, my asking, my suspicion, my failure to let things go. The real subject disappeared because I was suddenly on the defensive, no longer asking a question but answering one. Third, the management of isolation. I did not lose my friends dramatically. I lost them gradually. As his assessments of them accumulated across years, Miss Patricia always stirring something, Lorraine not as reliable as I thought, until the circle of people whose judgment I fully trusted had contracted to almost no one except the man who was deceiving me. A woman who trusts no one except her deceiver is, functionally, without a witness to her own life. She has no external check on what is real. Name these 3 things, because what is named can be seen. and what can be seen can no longer live invisibly inside your daily life and call itself normal. Here is something I need you to hear if there is a vulnerable person in your life. A parent, a grandparent, someone whose clarity is softening with age, someone whose wealth and inheritance and daily decisions have quietly moved into someone else's hands. Research proves that half of all people with dementia experience some form of abuse. Half. In the most vulnerable period of a person's life, when confusion is already a daily reality. The tactic of manufactured self-doubt does not just constitute emotional manipulation, it becomes exploitation at its most deliberate and most protected. The person doing it does not always look like a predator. They often look like the devoted one. They often look like the trusted family member who handles everything. They often look, from the outside, like everything is fine. And this, research confirms that 60 to 70% of abusers in these situations are men, usually the husband or the son. The very people we are conditioned, from the earliest age, to extend our deepest trust to without question. This is not a condemnation of all men. It is an observation about patterns. And patterns can be tracked and named and interrupted, but only if we are willing to look at them honestly with clear eyes, instead of looking away to protect a relationship that has already cost more than we can calculate. If you are sitting somewhere right now, and something in this story has landed in a place that feels familiar, if some part of what I have described sounds like a room you are still standing inside, I want you to know, the fog is not permanent. The floor is not the end. And the voice that has been telling you for years that your perceptions are unreliable is not your own voice. It was placed there, carefully and deliberately, by someone who needed you confused. You can name that. And once you name it, you can begin the work of giving it back. I buy yellow flowers every single week. I have my grandmother's Bible, repaired along the spine, open to the page she marked when I was 12 years old. I have a Sunday circle of women who are learning to trust the weight of their own knowing. And I have a quiet town waiting for me on the other side of the state, and a silver car I intend to drive there on a clear morning when the windows are clean and the air belongs entirely to me. Tell me where you are listening from today. What city, what coast, what Sunday morning or Tuesday commute or sleepless night brought you here? And tell me, when that phone lit up on the counter at 11:32 on a Thursday night, when the text said, "She figured it out yet?" What would you have done next? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone. I mean that in the most literal sense. If this story found something true in you, like it so this channel knows to keep making space for stories like this one. Subscribe if you want to stay. We are here every week. And every week belongs to another woman telling her story in her own words, the way she actually lived it. And if you know someone right now who is sitting beside a phone that never rings, someone who has been apologizing for things she should never have had to apologize for, someone on the floor in the middle of the night with the worst thing she has ever learned still fresh in her hands, send this to her. That may be the most important thing you do today. Thank you for being here with me through all of it. Now go buy yourself some flowers.